Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhnio. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of August the 20th. So please join, like this video, share it, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and leave your comments below. I hope that during the next around, I hope not more than 15 or 17, something like this minutes, I will tell you the most important things which you should know about Ukrainian battlefield line. So let's move on with any other pose.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
One of the main conclusions of the past day is, in fact, the release of a video by our UA Reg team unit, who showed how on August 16th, that is 4 days ago, they destroyed a Russian general. Well, it's a pity they didn't eliminate him completely, but they did inflict serious damage, so to speak, traumatic amputations of both limbs and a complete loss of ability to work. All this concerns Lieutenant General Esedulla Abachev, who was at least the deputy commander of the Russian Federation's Sever military group, responsible for the occupation of Sumy region, for the offensive, for repelling our troops, and for driving them out of the Kursk region. Before this, Abachev had been put on the wanted list by the Security Service of Ukraine as the person responsible for the occupation of Luhansk region, and accordingly, this is how Abachev's car was hit on the Rylsk Khomutovka highway in the evening of August 16th. This had been known earlier. This is what this war criminal looked like, and now obviously he looks a bit worse. That is, he has a traumatic amputation. In fact, he has been put out of action, so to speak, and it was in this vehicle that he was taken out by the FPV drone crews, of the UA Reg team in the Kursk region. This was a really great story, a really great operation that spread widely on social media as a response, as a reminder to all war criminals that this is the inevitable fate that awaits them. When we talk about Abachev and his responsibility for the occupation of Luhansk region, it is also worth mentioning that yesterday there were some extremely striking hits carried out by the Security Service of Ukraine, specifically in the Luhansk region, in the settlement of Bilokurakine, where 2 warehouses were destroyed by the Security Service of Ukraine. These 2 warehouses were military depots belonging to the occupiers in Bilokurakine. The point is, now we will return to the map and take a look at why Bilokurakine is important. It is located on the railway line connecting Belgorod Oblast and, in fact, the Bakhmut-Pokrovsky-Lyman section of the front. And our long-range drones from the Security Service of Ukraine managed to reach this place. A service from NASA, the American Space Agency, recorded significant fires there, specifically in Bilokurakine, by the way. We might even be able to see all of this on the deep state map. Let's take a look at this. No, for some reason it's not showing. Anyway, so here is where Bilokurakine is. This is the line, the strip that connects Shebekino with Starobilsk and then continues through the territory of Luhansk region, actually supplying both the Lyman front and the Pokrovsk sector. Well, right here, 2 security service depots were hit. And that's not all. Because these series, it's really already a reality show, as they say, about destroying enemy troops and enemy railways, again, specifically railway transportation. It's important to understand that for the Russians, the railway is the backbone of their logistics, and strikes like the one in Bilokurakine seriously work against the Russian troops. And strikes on the railway in the temporarily occupied territories of Zaporizhzhia also work very much against the Russian troops. Here, we need to be more attentive. First of all, yes, let's take a closer look at this branch, and we'll see that Bilokurakine, Starobilsk, Novoaidar, these are essentially the only logistical railway hubs here, and cutting them off prevents the Russians from using the railway in this area going forward. I don't think that the railway in Bilokurakine itself is damaged, but the ammunition depots that were used here are clearly damaged. Next is the favorite section here between Chernihivka and Molochansk. There is a wonderful stretch of railway on the temporarily occupied territory of Zaporizhzhia, which has recently been hit extremely actively by our forces. This little strip, which can be extended further beyond Molochansk, because as you can see, there is no other line anywhere, neither above nor below, neither to the north nor to the south, except in this very narrow strip, which, to the great misfortune of the Russians, is also situated extremely close to the front, almost as close as one could possibly imagine. To the left, that is to the west, there are more branch strips, and to the right, that is to the east, there are also railway lines. Ideally, if we had the capability, we would have railways in Rozivka or Volnovaka as well, and they would be of much higher quality. But for now, Tokmak and these areas are suffering. Tokmak, Molochansk, Urozhain, and Chernihivka. Along this very railway line, in terms of disrupting Russian offensive actions during their summer offensive campaign, our forces have probably delivered a dozen or so very powerful strikes over the course of this summer campaign. And just yesterday, another such episode occurred. Petro Andriushchenko, the head of the Center for the Study of Occupation, was the first to show these photos, which display an entire, to be honest, this actually happened not even yesterday, as far as I understand. And here is an entire train of fuel tankers that was moving through the territory of Zaporizhzhia and in the area of Urozhain, right on that branch I'm showing you, between Urozhain, Tokmak, and Molochansk. The wagons were hit like this. Later on, the 65th Mechanized Brigade, which, as is known, operates in our Zaporizhzhia direction, also confirmed its involvement, its participation in these actions. The 422nd, if I'm not mistaken, Unmanned Systems Regiment Luftwaffe also took part in this operation. Well, there are a lot of different forces involved there. Obviously, our GUAR, Department of Active Operations, is working very actively here. They are doing an excellent job operating in the occupied part of Zaporizhzhia region. Well, the 65th doesn't have footage of the strikes, but the aftermath is there. I mean, there are no strikes shown in the video, but the consequences are visible. You can see that some trains have completely derailed, and that's not an easy task. It will take some work to clear it up. First, you need to wait until everything burns out, until everything settles down. These are the kinds of explosions, the kinds of fires that were recorded yesterday in Zaporizhzhia. And this is how it all looked from satellite images. In other words, the fire caused by the disruption of enemy logistics on the occupied territories in the south by our forces is visible even from space. And the most pleasing and remarkable thing is that this is far from the first time it has happened. During the period of the enemy's summer activity, let me repeat, our forces have actually struck this area at least 10 times publicly. And who knows how many more such strikes have occurred without being made public. This is one of the most effective ways to constantly create problems and put pressure on railway lines, preventing the Russians from advancing their offensive campaigns. As of today, we still observe that in Zaporizhzhia, despite statements about troop movements and other things, what is essentially happening is the disruption of the enemy's offensive as such. And to the Zaporizhzhia railway sabotage, add everything that has happened over the past 3 weeks in the territories of Rostov and Volgograd regions, as well as Krasnodar Krai. So all of this together creates a kind of symbiosis of those certain correct actions that our defense forces are taking to prevent, or rather to avert, these active operations. They are not just sitting idly by, but are actively and very, very energetically working to prevent them. That's what we saw in Zaporizhzhia. I think that overall it's not difficult to trace the connection, to put 2 and 2 together between the strikes on oil refineries, which over the past month, well, okay, specifically August, let's say the last 3 weeks. Over the past 3 weeks, oil refineries have been priority targets for our long-range drones. So between the oil refineries, the railway trains carrying fuel, the transport hubs like Bilokurakine or any other transport hubs, ultimately in the territory of the Rostov and Volgograd regions, which I've already mentioned. So it's not hard to draw these analogies, these connections between these strikes and the overall reduction in the capabilities and capacities of the Russian Federation, of the Russian troops to carry out deep, tactical, or not tactical, but rather operational and strategic advances deeper into the frontline territory. What the Russians can do with the resources they're using, because right now, mainly in the south, they are mostly relying on automotive vehicles. And this is something we've also seen in photos from our resistance movement, that even civilian fuel trucks are now being used to transport fuel and supply the occupiers. Already now there are difficulties with fuel for civilians, for the civilian population on the territory of the Crimean Peninsula. In the occupied territories of Zaporizhzhia, our task is to create a shortage and lack of fuel for the military. This is what our forces are now trying to achieve with all their actions aimed at influencing the Russian Federation. And due to the fact that a simple lack of fuel does not allow them to launch any deeper offensive operation, we can still say that in the territory of Zaporizhzhia region towards Zaporizhzhia, even though we have 3 points of tension, I will highlight them once again. These are the areas of Kamyanske, Orikhiv, and Huliaipole. Although, in my personal opinion, the Huliaipole direction is the most dangerous for us in terms of these tactical advances by the enemy, because here the enemy can create a kind of pincer movement. Claws advancing from, moving, and also threatening from the Novopavlivka direction. But as of today, the enemy does not have the capability to advance deeper towards Zaporizhzhia or anything like that, because unfortunately these rather manipulative statements are often heard when, for example, Commander-in-Chief Sirsky or President Zelensky says that the enemy is now stepping up its efforts in Zaporizhzhia. For some reason, people often associate this with the idea that enemy offensives or attacks in Zaporizhzhia mean an attack or assault on the city itself. But in reality, operations in the Zaporizhzhia region are a completely different story from actually advancing on the city. I am convinced that apart from the unfortunate shelling, like what happened last night, particularly with glide bombs when the enemy was shelling, Zaporizhzhia is not threatened by an infantry assault, although right now Russian forces are trying to escalate and realize this threat as much as possible with their advances towards Stepnohirsk. It is precisely in this area where they are currently the most active, the region around Kamyanske, advancing towards Stepnohirsk. Why do they want Stepnohirsk? Because to the left, that is to the west of Stepnohirsk, there are elevations which theoretically, if enemy UAV operators manage to establish themselves and build up forces there, they could use this tree line to affect the southern outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. In other words, drones would be able to reach Zaporizhzhia. And this is exactly what the occupiers want to achieve by advancing or trying to advance towards Stepnohirsk, because there have already been successful episodes of them entering the southern outskirts of Stepnohirsk. But here, as you can see in this area, the fighters of the 210th Assault Regiment repelled these attacks and pushed the occupiers back. So accordingly, right now, this is where the greatest activity is on the Zaporizhzhia front. But in my personal opinion, and I'll repeat this again, in my personal view, the greatest potential threats await us in the direction of Huliaipole. Because yesterday I went over this direction in detail, since we have a potential threat here from Novopavlivka, and there's also a threat from Malinivka towards the settlement of Huliaipole. And what exactly do these threats mainly consist of? The thing is, Malinivka is a village that forms part of the left flank of the defense for Huliaipole, and it has actually already been pushed through by the enemy, specifically Malinivka. These are the kinds of trends we're seeing here. Let me say a few more words about Dobropillia, because yesterday I already saw some opinions and even publications appearing from the very well-known and reputable French analyst Playfra. Is he French? I'm not sure if he's actually French, but Playfra. Anyway, he was one of the first to notice this negative trend developing near Dobropillia and to highlight it. Now he claims that supposedly in Kucheravy Yar, the Russians have retreated to a tiny strip of forest belt to the southeast from Dobropillia, well, more precisely, from Kucheravy Yar and from Dobropillia as well, in fact, that they've pulled back into this grove south of the village. And in fact, this Dobropillia salient has been almost completely cleared. To be honest, with all due respect to Playfair, I wouldn't rush to such conclusions, but ideally, perhaps in the future, this is exactly the scenario that should be implemented with the enemy forces concentrated in Kucheravy Yar, because that's where the enemy presence was perhaps the largest in this breakthrough sector, in these rabbit ears of the enemy towards Dobropillia. It's important to understand that it's far too early to relax in the direction of Pokrovsk, in particular because Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad remain priority targets for the enemy. Entering these cities as part of future campaigns still remains a truly top priority for the enemy, because the Russians are simply compelled, they absolutely need, for their own survival, before the onset of the autumn period, before around October to November when the foliage falls, to reach the outskirts of these cities. And they will do everything in their power as quickly as possible, delaying negotiations. There won't be, believe me, remember my words, there won't be any use from those Trump initiatives, because Putin is already clearly showing that he is dragging out the negotiations. He is ready to maneuver, to do whatever it takes. To say things like, well, we didn't agree to a trilateral meeting, or this meeting isn't at the leaders' level. And then this whole balalaika will start, with Putin playing in all different directions because he's stalling for time, because he believes that by October or November, his troops will be able to break through our front somewhere. Why by October or November? Because, let me repeat, that's when the greenery dies down and the war, in terms of its drone component, simply turns genocidal for those infantrymen left out in the open field. That's exactly why the Russians want to get out of the open fields and into the cities, into Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad, Kostiantynivka, Siversk, Lyman, and Kupiansk further north. These are their objectives and the goals they are trying to set for the near future. Unfortunately, in some places, there are improvements on their side. In particular, we're talking about the area around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. As for Kostiantynivka, although the enemy is advancing in the area of Shcherbinivka and Katerinivka, this section of the front is in general holding its defense quite steadily. Unfortunately, the situation is now worsening for us near Siversk, because even on the map, even on the deep state map, we can see that the enemy has advanced in the Serebryansky forestry area, and these advances in the Serebryansky forestry are quite significant losses for the Chudolis and Divolis forests, which now create an overhang and the prospect of the enemy moving to the other bank of the Siversky Donets River in this direction. This is something the occupiers have not managed to achieve even once during this war, to cross over to the same Serebryanka, to cross over to the same Dronivka. Crossing here means opening the gates to Siversk. And this is actually a very negative trend. You can see that the enemy is also advancing in Hrayhorivka. This is a very negative trend that overall will further affect Yampil and then Lyman, which is located right here. In other words, the enemy is also trying to break into the cities here. It should be acknowledged that they potentially have the prospects to capture Siversk, but for now, only potentially. However, this is a continuation of the worsening trend in the Serebryansky forestry area. It is obvious, and it will continue further. Here, our defensive lines were apparently, as I understand it, weakened. Right now, the 53rd Mechanized Brigade in Serebryanka in particular is doing everything it can. But it's difficult to do this when the enemy has significant reinforcements and very rarely experiences a shortage of personnel. And this is exactly what we are currently observing in the Lyman direction. So this is the first factor in the worsening of the situation, the escalation of the situation in Lyman. By the way, it's worth noting that the Lyman front, in terms of the General Staff's reports, is almost always mentioned in second place. Second or third place, constantly sharing the silver and bronze with the Novopavlivka direction. So Pokrovsk comes first, then Lyman or Novopavlivka are in second or third place. And then come the other fronts. I think that now Zaporizhzhia will start to take the lead a bit. In the Kupiansk area, there are reports from our soldiers that, well, the occupiers who have taken this right bank bridgehead near Dvorishna are having a very hard time there. They've actually gotten stuck in the fields here. They can't get into Kupiansk. Dvorishna doesn't allow them to concentrate their forces there. As a result, they're stuck in the fields. And in fact, the Russian occupiers are still hearing and smelling the stench of last year's corpses as they decompose there, because no one can simply evacuate them across the river. That's why now they're trying as much as possible to pile up these bodies, to gather the corpses together, so at least they're not scattered all over the tree lines. And here, over the past year of fighting in this area, the occupiers have actually lost quite a lot, a significant amount of resources. In the Vovchansk area, a region that isn't all that publicly covered, Vovchansk itself, and to the east of it, the Vovchansky Kutori and forests, that's the area we're talking about. By the way, it's worth noting here that the enemy has started to use ground-based robotic systems more actively. This is already quite an active feature, so to speak, of this area. And not just using them, but using them for remote mining, delivering supplies and ammunition. Basically, that's exactly what ground-based robotic systems are meant for. As for evacuating the wounded, our soldiers haven't observed that yet. Well, it's highly doubtful that the Russians will use them for evacuating the wounded at all. When they drive their infantry to slaughter, it's unlikely they'll bother evacuating anyone. Actually, right now we're already seeing increased activity of this NRC ground-based robotic component on the enemy's side. And as always, Vovchansk, it's basically a real testing ground for the enemy. It was there that fiber optic drones were tested for the first time. Now, ground-based robotic systems are being deployed there in large numbers. Remember, it was there that the 2,500 kilogram cabs were tested for the first time, as well as other cabs with extended range, and all of this is being used there in the north of the Kharkiv region. It's really like some kind of real-life testing ground in the hands of the Russian occupiers. Well, that's how things are. They're not the best, they're not the worst, they're somewhere in the middle, and that probably is a sign of a certain stability. I'll take the risk of saying it, a sign of a certain stability. And with that, I'll put a period. Thank you, friends, for your attention. Take care of yourselves, all the best, and until we meet again.